Welcome to the afternoon breakout called Building Places in Cities. And the focus of this group is to really explore the themes that we laid out during the opening plenary around the intersection between philanthropy and public policy, but looking in particular at strategies that are focused on places and cities and neighborhoods. And we have a really outstanding group that we've put together. And if it's okay, we're going to try something a little bit different. I'm going to introduce them, but we're going to have kind of a conversation up here as much as we can on a dais, and pull you in as much as we can along the way. I'm going to start by introducing this group. I'm Elwood Hopkins, by the way. And to my left is Wendy Jackson. During the opening plenary, we heard a lot about some of the bold and creative work that's going on at the Kresge Foundation, and I think it's fair to say that much of it is the direct result and responsibility of Wendy Jackson, who is the Deputy Director of Community Development and Detroit Programs at the Kresge Foundation. She is from Michigan and she has a BA in Political Science and Communications from the University of Michigan, as well as a Master's in Social Work, within which she concentrated in community organization and social planning and policy. She worked at the Grand Rapids Community Foundation, where she was the director of family and children and family programs, and also the executive director of educational initiatives. She's also a memorial fellow from the German Marshall Fund, and come on in, as well as now she's, of course, at the Kresge Foundation, where she's managing some really bold and ambitious work. And full disclosure, she and I are actually working on an effort for the USC Center on Philanthropy and Public Policy that you heard a little bit about earlier. I think most parents have thought at one time or another, gee, it would be really great if my child were a doctor or a lawyer. To my left, we have someone who decided to do both, which is always good, yes. A little more background on this underachiever. He has has a degree, actually has a degree in neurophysiology from McGill in Quebec, as well as a degree in law from the Boalt Hall School of Law at Berkeley, and his medical degree from Johns Hopkins. He's practiced as a physician at Stanford Hospital's AIDS Clinic, is that right? As well as the City of San Francisco Department of Health. Has been a practicing attorney and health policy advocate for Consumers Union, and has also been the director of Health and Human Services and medical school programs efforts at these, something like that, for the city of Stamford, Connecticut, and the director of the Alameda County Public Health Department. And now, of course, he is the senior vice president for healthy communities at the California Endowment. And this is a man I admire not only for his credentials, but because he has brought so much to the field of place-based work and some really fresh thinking to something that we all care about. And then finally,
I'm interested to hear what you're going to say. I'm a little intimidated up here right now. How is Elwood going to cover me right now? Okay.
Well, I should probably, Dannielle and I have known each other for so long and so well that I should probably recuse myself as moderator when it comes to Dannielle. She has a degree in sociology from UCLA, and after that went to KTLA TV to do some very important kind of public health-oriented democracy documentaries. I'm sorry, KCET.
Yeah,
what did I say?
KTLA.
Oh, sorry.
No, I'm joking. I like KTLA.
Anyway, documentaries with support from the Center for Disease Control and County Department of Education, and then began what I consider to be one of the most committed careers in corporate social responsibility at Bank of America, starting not only locally in charge of philanthropic contributions in LA, market development manager, which is an integrative function looking at volunteerism and philanthropy and many other public-facing activities for the bank, at a national level, working as a director of philanthropic contributions, pushing national foundation guidelines down into the local regions and the local markets, and now globally as senior vice president of the Bank of America Corporation and national philanthropy director, focusing on a lot of not only national efforts but global partnerships around disaster relief and basic needs and integrated services. Is that right?
That was nice, thank you.
Well, there's one more thing. she's also been a co-conspirator with me on several very significant place-based initiatives that she really led. She was a board member of Los Angeles Urban Funders and also one of the key architects of the America Block by Block initiative, which was Bank of America's place-based effort. Is that good?
That was great, Elwood. Thank you.
All right, great. So I want to start the conversation with you, Wendy, if I can.
Okay.
And Rip so eloquently explained earlier some of the really bold ways that the Kresge Foundation has kind of stepped out of conventional roles and done some really inventive things in Detroit in the wake of the bankruptcy, the mortgage crisis, and the overall weakened state of local government. I was wondering if you would like to say a little bit more about some of the roles that the Kresge Foundation has played in Detroit, specifically around this lens of interacting with local government, and maybe give us a little more, drill down a little bit more and tell us some things that maybe Rip wasn't able to say in the time available.
Sure, it was, I had all these great notes and they were eloquently prepared, and then after that plenary, I'm just going to freeform now.
We'll do it. We'll all do it.
But I think, overall, the big picture around our work in Detroit, and particularly around the theme of the intersection of philanthropy, place, and government, has been one where we've had to really step up and stand in the gap, particularly during the time of the economic downturn from 2008 to 2013, and wrestling with the economic crisis, the foreclosure crisis, and bankruptcy, all within that span of time. Plus, as Rip talked about on the plenary, during the plenary session, just the complete collapse, really, of the public sector. And the only kind of viable sector left standing during that tumultuous period was philanthropy. And so we immediately had to act very differently and just get out of our comfort zone and start to think about reshaping philanthropic role while the train in some ways was moving down the track. Some of these moves that we made were extremely well thought out, and we tried to be as strategic as possible. Other moves, required us to get a little bit more creative as things emerged. So it was just trying to, I think, maintain this really interesting and delicate dance during that time period. The 6 items that Rip lifted up during his talk around setting the table, building civic capacity, our role as risk taker, guarantor of value, being a real Sherpa for Detroit during this time of crisis, and how we work to kind of steward these fragile ecologies in the city. All happened simultaneously. It wasn't in this kind of sequence of effort. We had to kind of embrace them all at the same time in real time. And so one of the things that we did first and foremost was to really think about how do we set the table and what do we work on as a foundation during this time period. And we basically built a framework that we called Reimagining Detroit. Rip really sat down and looked at where we had kind of pockets of energy, things that had trajectory and could move to help stabilize and begin to rebuild Detroit during the downturn, and kind of taking those areas of energy and identifying those as places or issues that we could start to really drill down and focus on. So the Reimagining Detroit framework was really our first effort at kind of looking at the entire landscape of the city, kind of building from strength, seeing where there were pockets of work that we could, particularly if we put some philanthropic muscle and resources behind, could start to carry Detroit through to the other side as it went through these crisis periods. So our Reimagining Detroit framework is 9 focus areas. And I won't drill down here at this point, but we can definitely talk about them in the Q&A. But they really range the gamut of civic life, from transportation to arts and culture, to the education, to land use reforms and policies. So many of them were areas that philanthropy hadn't traditionally worked in. But we knew that they were important kind of building blocks for kind of thinking about Detroit in the long term. It was easy for us perhaps to start to get paralyzed by what was in front of us. 80,000 vacant properties that needed to be addressed. I can't remember how many mayors we went through in the period of 4 years, one of whom did go to prison.
Twice.
Twice.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, I know.
I tried to rely on that. And I could just go on and on with the statistics. So it was really trying not to get paralyzed by what was in front of us and think about, which is the beauty of our role in philanthropy, is being able to not only look at the short term, but really think about long term. What are the building blocks that we could begin to put in place to help the city? Because we knew the city was going to go through and get through this period and get through it in a way that would start to shed some light on the other side. So that's where that was our North Star, is looking at those 9 areas and identifying, okay, if we start to put the resources behind these themes and these organizations and really issue areas, when this crisis passed, we would have something to build on.
And the crisis will pass. And I think another question I have is, because the Kresge Foundation was so bold into stepping into a vacuum and taking on some new roles when government wasn't fully present, what's it going to look like as government starts to return to some stability or equilibrium? What kind of role, have you given thought to that at the foundation, about what it will feel like as things begin to kind of become normal, and how do you keep that creativity alive?
Yeah, I think it's one of the things that's keeping our team at Kresge up at night a little bit. Mainly because during the period of the crisis, something kind of important came out. One of the most important things was around this role of distributed leadership. Because you didn't have one single sector that was strong enough to carry the city forward, you had multiple organizations and sectors that were coming together, kind of thinking through and problem solving together. Now that we've gone through the crisis of the bankruptcy and we're kind of in this period of recovery and kind of moving toward, I think, reset, we do have a stronger municipal government. And that comes with some interesting challenges as well as opportunities. One of the things I think we're trying to think through at the foundation of how we can kind of continue the spirit and the momentum that was built around this distributed leadership model in the city, and how that can be maintained to carry it forward into a period of transformation. But you do have a stronger municipal government that, to be quite candid, is thinking about how to centralize a lot of these functions again. And so not having history repeat itself is something that we're thinking pretty strongly about right now at the foundation.
If I can maybe ask a very specific question about, if you could maybe tell the group a little bit about the Detroit Future City Framework, because I think that's a perfect example of how philanthropy stepped into a role that was free from the resource limitations and bureaucracy of government, but also free, one might say, from the overall framework of democratic accountability. And yet there's a great story, I think, about how you approach that. If you could maybe tell the group.
Sure. So Detroit Future City, if you distill it or crystallize it, it's really a blueprint for Detroit's future, a 50-year blueprint for Detroit's future that was designed to be implemented really around 5-year increments. And the genesis of it came as a result of a conversation around a table that Rip had the foresight to set in 2007. It's called the Detroit Neighborhood Forum, and it's a place where all the funders in Detroit are able to come together every month. And the table is still going today. We have a meeting next week, as a matter of fact. But it's a place where we've all come together every month, those funders that have been focused on not only neighborhood revitalization in Detroit, but I think just overall civic transformation. And it was as a result of that forum and the conversations in 2008 around knowing that bankruptcy and some of these other issues were looming. It was a conversation around how do we begin to get a handle on a number of key issues. Many of them became part of our framework, and one of those was land use. And so as a result of the conversation about how can Detroit take what essentially is 40 square miles of vacant land and put it back into productive use that becomes more of an economic asset, how can we begin to have that conversation with the city? And so Detroit Future City became the outgrowth of that process. We started conversations with the mayor at that time in about 2008, 2009, looking at some of the other kind of citywide strategic direction setting processes that have occurred not only within our country, but also in Europe in particular. And, you know, it was met with some skepticism. You know, who is this foundation that wants to come in and you want to do what? You want to create a strategic blueprint for land use in the city of Detroit. And so it was a delicate dance of negotiating and trying to, I think, really present a role for the city while at the same time making sure that we built a process that had a lot of community and resident input around basically the essential question, what should be the future of Detroit? And to shorten the story a little bit, we were able to get through that process. It was a multi-stakeholder, multidisciplinary effort that engaged about 200,000 residents in the city of Detroit who had the chance to answer that question. And as a result, we were able to create a framework that is a carrying document for our city going forward around, I think, key pillars of transformation.
Great, thank you. I want to move on to Tony now, but before I do, it would be unfair to I think everyone would like to know a little bit about, first of all, please tell me that's not water, because I want to ask you a question about Flint. Can you just say...
Good God. Yeah,
Too soon.
seriously.
It's iced tea.
Can you say a little bit about how the Kresge Foundation and how philanthropy in general is responding?
I hope this is not going to be on Twitter.
Yes, please don't write us letters. About how it's responding to Flint, and in particular, in terms of the relationship between philanthropy and government.
So, specifically, Flint is our neighbor. The Kresge Foundation is about a 30-minute drive from the city of Flint, where our main headquarters is. And Flint has been, particularly the philanthropic community in Flint, has been a partner in many of the transformation efforts that have been underway in Detroit over these last several years. So, practically, at a practical level at the foundation, we're looking at, again, what is our role and where can we be of most help and best use. Karen Aldridge-Deason is in the room. She's a great partner with us as we kind of think about this issue, not only within our own foundation, but the philanthropic community across the state. Karen runs the Office of the Foundation Liaison in Michigan and works closely with state government and is a Flint resident. But internally, we're thinking about it in terms of what can be Kresge's philanthropic role. We've identified a couple of areas that I can get into in more detail during the Q&A. And in some ways, though, we've identified roles that mirror some of the roles that we're setting in Detroit in terms of how can we kind of use our tools, whether they be grant making or social investment, and make sure that they are a resource to the Flint community. We're thinking quite heavily about what's going to happen to state government as a result of this crisis, and seeing some parallels to what we saw with municipal government in Detroit that are quite challenging. So I think the chapter is still to be written, but just given the response not only within our own institution, but nationally among philanthropy, trying to identify where are the important points of intersection we're going to have to find out together.
Oh, thank you. Tony, I think most people here probably are aware that the California Endowment approaches place on two levels. It looks at 14 geographically targeted communities, but then is also in kind of a dual strategy pursuing policy objectives at the same time. And hoping that there'll be some interrelationship between those two. Could you say a little bit about those two levels of work and how you see them interacting?
Yes, sure. First of all, good afternoon, everybody. And I think it follows well off of Wendy's description of sort of the constellation of kind of strategies that you want to look at when you're trying to improve the environment in a community. And our basic theory of change in community, and it's not radical, it's pretty straightforward, is that health really derives from sort of the environmental determinants, the places where people work, live, play, and pray. And we can analyze those environmental determinants and try to understand how to optimize the resources within that environment that are health protective and minimize the risk. And our strategy is based on trying to change the odds that people will essentially be able to pursue healthy outcomes in an environment. And then our theory of change says, well, how do you change environment? The primary determinants of the environment are policies and systems that shape those environments and create the conditions and resources that people have available to them. So we have to participate in policy change and systems change. And how do you do that? Well, you have to build the capacity of communities to actually participate in what are largely political decision-making bodies. So our theory is basically build the capacity of people to participate in decision-making locally, regionally, at the statewide level, change policies and systems that optimize health and the resources that are associated with healthy lives. And ultimately, our goal is to change those environments to make them maximally health protective. And we realized you can't do that all at the local level because we like to think of a young child and his or her mother opening their front door in the morning and walking out into the community, and what do they encounter environmentally? Well, the first thing they encounter is a neighborhood. And we know that a lot of the levers for neighborhood change are local. I mean, they may be land use, zoning. It has to do with how resources are distributed across the community, like parks and grocery stores, and then, of course, the noxious influences like liquor stores and fast food. So that environment is shaped both by local decision-making, by regional decision-making, and by state-level decision-making. So we have to have access to the levers of policymaking at all three of those levels if we want to actually reshape that environment. Well, when they're walking through the neighborhood, they're probably going somewhere. They're probably going to go to a school if it's a child, and so we want to think about the educational environment. How do we optimize that environment? And we recognize that a lot of the levers for that are local, but there are also some very big state levers in California, and we've been through a couple of great examples of that with the so-called local control funding formula that has redistributed essentially school funding in a way that feels much more equitable, and there's an effort now to implement that locally. So you've got a mix of sort of local and state levers for policy change. And then we're a health foundation, so we couldn't pass up the opportunity to try to double, triple, quadruple down on the Affordable Care Act implementation in California. So we went to town on that. Actually, we went to our board. One of our board members is right there. In fact, I think it was he who said, if you're going to do this, you do this big. And he gave us $350 million to do it. Mm-hmm. We said, we're going to take that and we're going to implement the Affordable Care Act with our partners. And have felt that has been a very successful implementation. We have 4 million, actually 5 million new people on Medi-Cal in California than when we started, which is a huge improvement for the lives of people that are experiencing that. But the levers for those policy changes are federal and state. So there's not a lot you can do in a local community around trying to influence the implementation of the Affordable Care Act other than to enroll people and to try to work with your local providers to optimize the kind of care that they're going to be able to deliver to people. So if you want to be effective at policy and systems change, you have to be able to operate at multiple levels simultaneously. We have great examples, which I can talk about in a second, of how that actually works and why we think it's a successful recipe.
Let's hear it.
Okay, so the big example for us.
Right?
Well, this one was, this is a fun thing to talk about because it really, if I had been a betting man, I would have bet against this. And it's a good thing I don't bet. So we're a health foundation. We like to think that we're all smarty pants, people that have lots of degrees behind their names, and we can look at a community and figure out what it needs. So we cooked up, basically in a smoke-filled room, a strategy.
That's not healthy.
Yeah, it was marijuana smoke. So.
Medical.
So we cooked up this plan that had 10 outcomes associated with it, and we kind of came marching into our 14 communities and laid out the plan and said, hey, what do you think of this? Isn't this cool? And it was kind of interesting because our communities were very polite. They said to us, 10, huh? 10, that's too many. But when we look through them, they actually make a lot of sense. We think that they make some sense, but we want to take this and we want to rework this a little bit. And some of our team said, no, take it or leave it. And others said, that's cool. Let's let them sort of play with this a little bit. And we got back their feedback. And amongst the feedback we got was that, if you're going to work on some of these issues, particularly around youth, you have to look at the school system. You have to look at the school-to-prison pipeline. You have to look at this issue of school push-out. And we said, oh, no, we're not an education foundation, we're a health foundation, so we can't do that. And we started hearing this in the Central Valley, in Los Angeles, in Oakland, in various places, that these kids are being suspended and expelled at very high rates. So we said, okay, well, let's take a look at least the data. We looked at the data, and there's something approaching 800,000 suspensions a year in California. This was in 2009, 2010. About 400,000 kids being suspended and expelled, which is really more than fits into every baseball, football, sports stadium in California. And we thought, well, that's a lot. And the disproportionality, particularly for African American kids, Latino kids, Native American kids, was off the charts. So we started thinking, we said we were going to be in partnership with community. The community has put this very legitimate issue in front of us. The data is overwhelming. We are a health foundation, but we recognize that this is a critical social determinant of health. We need to engage. So we engaged with our policy advocate friends who had been working on this issue for a long time, but we really brought them together in a statewide coalition with organizers and all of these districts and students and parent coalitions that have been working on this. And they went to town, generated something like 7 policy proposals. This is in 2012 when California was bankrupt. And the rule was that there was not, if a piece of legislation had a nickel price tag, it wasn't going to get the governor's signature. And that year our partners brought 7 pieces of legislation, got 5 signed. And the next year we got 2 more signed. And now suspensions and expulsions have been plummeting in California. They're down 40%. It's 200,000 fewer suspensions in California since when we started. And that is because we had the ear and authentic voice of community locally who could prioritize this issue amongst all of the basket of issues that we gave them. They said, this is real. We need to work on this. We will get behind this and organize to raise this issue up. If you can deliver this statewide to create a policy movement that can change policy. Once the policy changed, we now have the ability to implement that locally. So we didn't go into this thinking, school discipline is something we're going to do. We certainly didn't expect to see as dramatic and rapid a fall in suspensions and expulsions. But our model facilitated this sort of connection from local up to state and then back down to local, which we think is actually a secret sauce.
The California Endowment really stepped into a planning process, which for many people is the domain of the public sector. And I'm wondering, what was your point of entry into the communities to begin with, to kind of be seen as a legitimate instrument for planning? And how do you see that interacting? I mean, you've already answered it in part, I think, in terms of how it filters up into statewide policy. But how does it interact with other plans that perhaps are already generated by the public sector?
Yeah, so, and this is a big issue. This comes up all the time. First of all, we're a statewide foundation, which I think is a blessing. So we're not foreigners. It's not like we're coming in from someplace and parachuting in. People know us. I mean, we've been funding for this is our 20th anniversary. We've been funding for 20 years in California in most of these places. So we're known. We're known by government. We're known by the health department. We're known by the healthcare providers. And so they don't think of us as, being these kind of dilettantes per se, although we are in philanthropy, so we do get tagged with that label. So we could, our entree into communities was through trusted partners, people that we had been working with that we knew, including health departments, local governmental entities.
It's interesting. Yeah.
And so there wasn't the level, I think, of there was some, definitely. Whenever there's a new initiative and it's, it's got sort of all of these pretensions of grandeur, people will be suspicious and doubtful. But we had trusted entrees into the community, so we were able to sort of make our proposals and be flexible enough to sort of negotiate with community. I think the real challenge is at the community level. The three constituencies that we were trying to get together were really what we called systems players. So that was like, the police, land use agencies, education, healthcare, and some others, criminal justice. So those were the systems players. And then it was community-based organizations. I mean, the ones that had been delivering services or advocating for youth or, protesting police violence, what have you. And then we wanted what we called unaffiliated residents, people who actually live in the place and experience the inequity from day to day. And that population is, you can't just bring them to the table with the police chief and, these sophisticated CBO directors. You have to kind of create a process by which they feel empowered, that they feel like that table is for them. And I think if we made one big mistake, it was not spending enough time working to build kind of the power and allowing community residents to develop their own agenda so that they wouldn't essentially feel intimidated at the table with others. But that, to me, that's the basic strategy for trying to get at this issue is that you come in through trusted partners and you spend the time listening and you make it very clear what your principles are, which is that we want community to be, the primary driver of this, although we will negotiate the agenda with the community. I'll say one last thing about this. When evaluators come in and they want to, evaluate you.
Yeah, how's that go?
Yeah, so the first thing they say is, okay, tell us, are you community driven or are you foundation driven? And, we hem and we haw and we say, well, it depends on the issue, it depends on the time. Sometimes we're community-driven, sometimes we're foundation-driven. And they're like, no, you have to decide. Which is it? You're going to confuse your partners and the field. And, we pushed back and we said, that's a false dichotomy. This is a dialectic. You're always negotiating. You can't have a fixed agenda and you can't have a hidden agenda. And so we've argued that we need to toss this false dichotomy of community-driven versus foundation-driven and recognize that it's both.
And if I could just pick up on that, because
Yes, please.
Wendy and Anthony have been mentioning about leadership, right? How do we build leadership? I think all of us, including Kresge, I was in the room with Kresge a couple weeks ago in San Francisco about your leadership development programs, and I think all of us are trying to address or look at leadership differently in terms of not building just the leadership within the organization, but how do you build community? Right. And that's, we're training, we've been in the program training neighborhood builders. We could have a neighborhood builders program where we take executive directors and emerging leaders and take them through a training, give them $200,000 of operating support to build capacity. But the issue now we're looking at as we look after 10 years is, okay, so what are they doing with this leadership? And some are succeeding or have gone through a succession. But I do think right now it's time to look at what do we talk about or what do we mean by leadership within a community, across sectors, public. And you're right, I think a lot of us was in that neighborhood work. We're in that neighborhood work and said we didn't do enough advanced work and planning and building the community leaders in those planning processes.
Danielle, I want to hold that thought. I come back to this idea of leadership. Before we do that, it's impossible to talk about change in any place without the private sector or the market being present. How many efforts on the part of the public sector and philanthropic sector are about leveraging corporate engagement and leveraging the market? And here you represent the market, and yet you also represent philanthropic strategy, and you also interact with government. Can you say a little bit, maybe drawing on some of the other place-based initiatives that you've been a part of, what is it that the corporate sector brings to the table that the other sectors don't?
Well, location, first of all. I mean, we're in every market within the country. We actually are within, let's see, 1 every 2 households banks with Bank of America. So
Wow.
in terms of customer market demand, looking at the environment from a fiscal, from a customer base. All those, I think, factors play into what the corporations do locally and nationally. And so over the last 2 decades, as I've known Elwood for the last 20 years, try not to age ourselves, I know.
Well, we were only 7.
We were 7. In this work, in this field, you've seen evolution of place-based and what we mean by place. And we've gone through the roller coaster, needless to say, of, all right, let's focus on 4 neighborhoods across the country. Well, it started with LA Urban Funders, and gosh, when was that? I see a lot of our founding partners in the room. 90, after the unrest.
10 years ago.
Yeah, it was
Yes,
10 years
thank
ago,
you.
that's right.
1990.
Maybe 3, yeah, after the civil unrest. And talk about like a moment in time, too, if you think about the disruption there. And we're all actually entering into another disruption. I mean, Dr. Ross talked about income inequality, social justice, and all these things that we're talking about is actually economic mobility, right? And that is a social justice issue. So as we look in and think about how we partner amongst, driving change, right, as change agents, we do have a responsibility, and if anything, the last 10 years have showed us different ways on how we can help mobilize communities, whether it's through nonprofits, whether it's through our lines of business. I mean, we've been, I don't want to say playing, but we have entered into a space of the pay for success models. We actually put an offering out about 13.5 million. It was 13.5 million in New York. And that was truly a partnership with Foundation, the New York State, couple of social finance and intermediary. I mean, there was about 5 or 6 players in that. And that was truly a response to our customers, our U.S. Trust Merrill Lynch customers saying, there's a generation of wealth that's being inherited, and they want to invest in social good. Not that environment's not that technology, not that investments are made, but it was us, and it took us about 1.5 years to put that market and that vehicle into the market. So we're, again, looking at different ways to help move communities forward.
Banks financial institutions are under a lot of scrutiny these days when it comes to these questions of the economic divide. And you did mention the word equity. To what extent does the bank in its philanthropic strategy or business strategy actually talk about social equity? I mean, is that comfortable language?
Yeah, it is. I mean, it's an organizing principle for us. And I think we talk about it in the framework of economic mobility. The purpose of the company is to make the financial lives better of the people we serve. So with the philanthropic strategy, the mission is, well, we're aligned to the purpose of the company in the work that we do. So I do think, as I mentioned, when we think about the focus around housing, jobs, workforce development, those are the issues we talk about in terms of this is how we do it, and this is what we do, but the how is who we're serving and how we're helping build those communities. So, and I would have to say that I think you'll see some interesting things as we move forward.
Like what?
You walked right into that one.
I know. Well, in terms of the narrative.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, no. I think bringing, as a company and as a financial institution, the notion of social justice, income inequality, equity, we get a little bit nervous about that. But I think in terms of the narrative, as I mentioned, if we don't address those issues moving forward, then economies won't thrive, neighborhoods won't thrive, and then we won't thrive as a financial institution. So.
Yeah. You also mentioned about the lines of business, and I know that there's a lot of concern about kind of conflict of interest, and to what extent, and yet what other institution really, other than a bank, can affect so many personal decisions of economic livelihood, whether people own homes or own businesses or are able to afford college. And so the products and services that the bank offers can potentially help low-income communities. In the current governmental regulatory environment, is it, and I know this is probably more of a line of business question, but I know you always keep a foot in that world. And to what extent does is it easier or harder now for the bank? I mean, how does the bank think about its lines of business when it thinks about this strategy of economic mobility on the philanthropic side?
It's a line. It's about alignment. And I think it's neither easier nor harder. It continues to evolve. I mean, if you think about 2000 to now, we acquired Merrill Lynch, we acquired Countrywide, and a lot, and you can speak to this too more eloquently.
Hey, I'm
too.
the moderator.
I know, but in 2000, we were separate, right? I mean, we're going to operate silos. Oh, that's the foundation over there doing their good work and, altruistic and making the brand, marketing, all that good stuff. But no, absolutely not. It was, if anything, the recession showed us is that there had to be strategic alignment in the work that we do, whether you call it CSR, ESG, or what have you, or just pure philanthropy. There was complete alignment. We're in terms of the conversation. We talk about business integration, making sure our work on the philanthropic and CSR side is realized and alive in the vernacular of all our lines of businesses. So I would say that we continue to evolve, and it is directly aligned to the work that we do.
And you also mentioned something that was intriguing, the Merrill Lynch customers who are affluent individuals and their own philanthropy. And I don't think we often think about a corporation as being an organizing principle for the philanthropy of its clients. How does that work? I mean, how light a touch do you have to have? What's the conversation like with the Merrill clients?
Well, unfortunately, I don't get to talk to the Merrill clients directly.
They keep you
every day.
separate.
No. I mean, the way that we view philanthropy, so back to that, and there was a study, the U.S. Trust and Merrill Lynch did a study within, as I mentioned, our clients and customers, and said 70% said we want to invest in social good of the survey they did. So that took us to another level, and of course, Merrill Lynch is a line of business, talk about communities, talk about the things we're doing, talk to us about how we're getting things done, and how I view it, philanthropy gets a seat a lot of the dialogue. So we have this convening power, and I look at Mr. Greco, who was at NFF, and a couple in the room, in terms of having the opportunity to take conversations across the country, in situations like this, in terms of how do we elevate the community and how do we elevate the conversation. So I really see philanthropy as a driver to seed some of this conversation, and to be quite frank, in some of the work that I do, and let's call it, what is my title? Enterprise Programs and Strategies. Part of my job is to drive what we're doing across the enterprise. So across the lines of business, introduce what we're doing on the philanthropic side and how we can be a benefit to the lines of business, and talk about the work that the bank as a whole does.
I mean, that's an army of people at Bank of America. I'm not even sure what's the size now.
220,000 employees across the globe. And to be quite honest, I should have talked about volunteers in the conversation around neighborhood, because we have those banking centers. They're the face of the community. I mean, those branches, what they're called financial centers now, are really the ones that are having the face-to-face interaction with the customers and out there trying to engage in meaningful ways. And we do have about, we had 2 million hours donated last year from our employees across the country. And we look at them as a huge capital and a huge force in terms of the work that we do. What we do here wouldn't be realized if we didn't have volunteers deploying it and really connecting to communities in a meaningful way. So employees are one of the strongest assets that the banks or any financial institution or any corporation has to bring to the table when we talk about moving neighborhoods.
We often forget that really no foundation has the physical infrastructure that a financial institution like Bank of America has. You're literally located in most of the neighborhoods or close to them that are most heavily impacted by concentrated poverty. One thought, I'm thinking about what is unique about what a corporation brings to place-based work in terms of just the way a bank like Bank of America will think about a neighborhood, approach it, the knowledge base that it has, the skills that are internal. Can you say a little bit more about how it differs from, say, a private foundation?
Employees, subject matter expertise, convening power, tools, resources, assets, lending, investing, capital. I mean, obviously, we have the largest CDFI portfolio in the country, and about $1.2 billion of exposure, and we're partnering with about 200, most of the CDFIs across the country to deploy capital within the community. So, I think honestly, I think we have a lot to bring to the table when we talk about cross-sector partnerships and place-based. And what we've learned is it's not easy to replicate and duplicate the efforts that we've all been part of. So we're still looking at very local efforts, and local matters, and local is what lifts up a community. And we do have some national efforts, of course, but we do really do a good job of drilling that locally. And I hope, Winnie, that we're in Detroit with Tiffany and the market president. We talked to Bob Ross about building healthy communities when he was thinking about it 10 years ago, about how can the bank align. So there is a recognition that we have a role to play. And sometimes folks, I would say, are, well, let's see, what Bank of America, do they really, really care? And absolutely, we have to care. We have to be responsible in this way.
Great. Let me ask all of you a question really that Dannielle raised. I wanted to come back to it and then we'll open it up. This question of leadership, as we think about the intersection between what's going on in places, in communities, work that's being funded philanthropically, and then policy change, let's say, how do you think of how would you define the need for leadership? And tackle that question any way you want to, either in terms of community leadership, cross-sectoral leadership at a high level, leadership that's able to, with certain skills. What are your comments on leadership based on the work that you've been doing?
Well, in Detroit, it's been a critical underlying factor and principle for everything that we do and we have done. And we kind of see it hand in hand with building capacity, again, in this kind of distributed leadership model or approach, making sure that we have leaders at all levels of sectorial life and progress in the city. So we've been very intentional about where to kind of seed that kind of leadership development, both at the neighborhood level and also within municipal government in particular, as I think about, for example, our Detroit Revitalization Fellows Program, where we have had an open process for talent and leadership across the country that have an interest, particularly as they're mid-career, in working in place and working on transformational issues in place, to come to Detroit and get experience or additional experience and exposure in the municipal sector as well as the nonprofit sector at the neighborhood level. So we have many examples of where leadership has kind of been a cross-cutting theme all across our work.
Yeah, when we thought about, or when we think about it, because we're still thinking about it, we're 5 years through a 10-year initiative. $1 billion at the end, it's going to be more than $1 billion, but it'll be roughly $1 billion at the end of those 10 years. And we thought, okay, so in 2020, which is roughly the end point for building healthy communities, what will we leave behind in our communities? And this was a kind of a rollicking debate, at the foundation. And we categorized the things that would be left behind in three basic categories. One was actual resources, that there will be institutions that will have been built up, will have more resources and more capacity to essentially do whatever the work it is that they do. The second thing was we'd leave behind policy change, policy that's health protective and encourages a greater degree of participation in communities from a broader swath of the population. And the third thing was leadership, where is essentially people who had the experience of advocating on their own behalf, working within institutions, holding other institutions accountable, who had found essentially opportunities through their leadership work to go on to become city council members or school board members or what have you. And we thought of all of those three things, which of those things is least likely to regress over time? And certainly the resources one will regress over time. I mean, that's like gasoline. I mean, at some point you have to go to the gas station to get some more. The policies can be reversed. If the equilibrium changes and new political interests emerge that are hostile to these policies, they can actually tear these policies down. But the leadership sustains. And so we see that as probably the most critical leave behind capacity or lasting capacity of this work. And so we're now trying to spend a little bit more time getting kind of specific about the kind of leadership we want to build, the level of leadership we think is necessary to sustain this work in communities. and trying to tie our work in the future to building on the leadership capacity that we've built during these 10 years.
I think I would just want to take notice of leadership. We think about nonprofit leadership, community leadership, but we also think about the youth, right, and adults. And we also invest heavily in student leaders, high school students, millennials. Are there some millennials in the room? You're changing our world. You're changing us, and you're changing the way we think and approach work and approach business. So I want to put that in terms of intergenerational too, and that's something that I think we're all grappling with. No offense, millennials, but it is one of those. I mean, it's a dynamic shift in how we approach leadership.
We have 14 sites, 6 of them are rural, 8 of them are not rural. They're a mixture of suburban and urban. And in the rural sites, we certainly see, when we're shopping around for somebody to do something, we oftentimes cannot find, that entity. And so it's always a question about, do you try to build it, borrow it, or go without it? And the truth of the matter is we haven't been terribly good at this. And we've been looking around to try to find, including NFF, to try to find partners who are good at this. When we did our sort of assessment of sort of who our partners are, we found a similar kind of reality that we have a PRI program, and we were trying to figure out who's got the capacity to take some PRIs. And the bottom, particularly in some of the organizations that we're interested in building up, focus on youth development, because the youth development infrastructure in California has been decimated. And when we looked at them, they basically don't have that capacity. They have 10 days of cash. I mean, they're looking from day to day, and so we recognize that this is a real problem. What we're trying to do now is look at who are the anchor kind of organizations for this work going forward, and how do we get them general operating support as much as possible, and the kind of consultative support from organizations like NFF to help them come up with business models that allow them to move forward. I will say, though, I've been very disappointed by this. I recently gave our board a kind of an overview of our 5 big mistakes. And the 5th one was...
What board wouldn't love that PowerPoint?
Well, I actually loved it.
Yeah.
The 5th one was, falling into the myth of the market. This belief that, we could leverage private capital and kind of, salvage, these institutions with, market magic. And the reality is, trying to bring private capital to, fledgling, not-for-profit organizations, there's much more rhetoric than there is actual, real track record. And it's hard. These are not businesses. They are, organizations that, get government contracts and some philanthropic dollars, and they cross their fingers and they hope they get through the next 30 days.
Yeah, a very similar experience from our work in Detroit and the other cities that we're working in. Our primary tools have been general operating support and consultation services, but one of the things that we are looking at now is this issue of capital absorption. And to your point, Anthony, how can we really begin to put different or stronger tools in place within particularly our community-based organizations so that they can begin to at least meet the market and absorb capital halfway and in different ways?
I would just say from the position, and you mentioned NFF, and I think intermediaries are great, but they have also fallen into this banking restrictions. We need, as I think financial institutions, have to help them figure out how to unlock some of those dollars, because they're hard to get to those types of organizations that you're encountering. And we're at a moment in time, and we're working on an initiative with an intermediary to not only provide that operating capital, but also align it with some investment, or I should say some CDFI lending. So we're paying attention to it closely as well.
I'd actually like to just add, if I could, an example from Los Angeles Urban Funders, which I know some of you are aware of. There was a community where resident input at the level of thousands of people had identified workforce development as a core issue that they wanted to act on. There was an organization that was the obvious player, in fact, the only game in town to connect groups with businesses. However, that organization, while programmatically good and strong at the line staff level, had been in the newspaper for financial mismanagement. The president had been ousted by the board. There wasn't a single foundation in the consortium that was willing to fund it. However, what they just include, and by the way, public sector funders were running scared as well. And so, I mean, keeping with this theme. What happened was a group of foundations collectively decided that if they pooled the funds, they would take a risk and shore up the organization, which now required not only core operating support, but a lot of technical assistance and guidance. And I think that there are a lot of instances like that, where you say, okay, if we're gonna do this, we're gonna have to shore up the partner, because the reality is they're not as strong as they are. And sometimes that's something that's done better when holding hands with other funders. In communities where Bank of America doesn't have any infrastructure, but perhaps there's enormous need. Does the bank view communities like that, where you don't have that physical infrastructure? How do you respond to communities in need there as well?
Well, as I mentioned, we have other vehicles that we can lend, and you know, we have a leader in San Bernardino by the name of El Arguello. Do you know El, Steve?
Is that where Al is?
El is the market president. So we have, as I mentioned, leaders in place who are working in Al to his, God, I love Al. He's been with the company. I just have to put a little, you know, Al, 40 years with the company. And when this tragedy in San Bernardino happened, he came to the forefront and said, I mean, talk about a moment in time that we have to reflect and think about what we're doing in this community. So I would say we are, to your point, embedded in the community, and look at leadership like Al and leaders like Al and his leadership team to stay connected to that work. But, and I would say someone like Al is probably on the ground trying to figure out how to build San Bernardino up.
Yeah, in Detroit, you know, obviously we're thinking about it every day and have been quite intentional about building capacity within municipal government, funding people and expertise to, you know, we're only a year and a half out of bankruptcy, so it's a pretty fragile time, even though you know, we're on the rebound. So thinking about how to make sure that, in this case, municipal government has the talent and people that it needs to get through to this next period.
Tony?
Yeah, I would, you know, just say that the challenge for us, when we look across sort of where our funds go, you can look at it geographically, but if you take it one level down, you find that, you know, a lot of our funds go to intermediaries and you know, kind of policy shops, and they're based in the Bay Area and LA. And so even when we want to fund in the Central Valley or in the Inland Empire or in the Great North, we can't find the sort of the intermediaries that are based there to do that work. We've been going through this scrub of our budget to look for, you know, opportunities to move money to the Central Valley. And you know, the will is there, the actual ability sometimes to figure out how to fund people who are based there to build their capacity to do the work that you need to do. I gotta say, it's really hard. We're gonna continue to do it, not just because Steve tells us we have to do it, but because we think it's part of equity. We have to figure out ways to build that capacity, but I think that's a really tough question. You know, when I was in Alameda County, one of the things that we did, just out of frustration with that issue, because, you know, the California Endowment would come around, Wellness Foundation would come around and offer us $100,000 to do something, and we'd be like, well, what are we going to do with that? You know, I've got a $120 million budget. That's really not all that useful. Well, we did an analysis on a per household basis of the combined per capita investment. I'll call it investment out of just being charitable, but combined per capita spending on households in East Oakland between the health department, between police, between probation, and the state parole agency. And we found that on a per capita basis, it was about $6,000 per household. And in building healthy communities, our investment, if you look at it at a per household level, is about $10. So we knew that, you know, we had a bag of nickels compared to, you know, what government has. And the goal has to be leveraging those funds, which ultimately is why our theory of change is what it is. It's really, this is a political conversation about priorities. And the other thing in that data that was disturbing, although not unexpected, is that when you actually look at where that $6,000 per household goes, it's not going to that household. It's investing in people like me, in doctors and nurses and dentists and case managers and probation workers and whatnot. And those people at 4:35 in the afternoon get in their cars and race out to Walnut Creek and the suburbs and reinvest that money in restaurants and private schools. So we were literally subsidizing kind of a suburban lifestyle rather than looking at how to make sure that those dollars recirculate in those communities. And so that has to be part of the goal of this work. It's not just to pull government dollars, towards pressing priorities, but to look at how that money can recirculate in a way that builds some wealth and opportunity.
Right. Wendy, Dannielle?
I would say this is an interesting question, and it's one that I think will be the test of fire for us next in our work in Detroit, particularly around the retraction of state government and the challenges that we've experienced in Detroit, what you're seeing right now in Flint. I mean, it fundamentally comes from a lack of cogent policy around cities in our state and how at least state funding is allocated. And so I think that's kind of the next set of conversations that we're about to engage in our state around this issue. So no answer yet, but stay tuned. And I'm just going to use municipal government because of the Detroit context. What's the choreography now going forward? And I think it's going to be a healthy and good conversation because of the multitude of foundations and philanthropy that's working in the city. It's not going to be business as usual. So I don't think it's going to, the tendency will be for municipal government to try and kind of hit the reset button, but it's not going back.
I would say part of the challenge is to understand exactly what philanthropy is doing with the public sector, because I think I hear very kind of short elevator versions of what happened in Detroit as, philanthropy is picking up, they're back paying the pension fund. And picking up a public sector bill is not really what's happening here. There are some systemic changes being put in place, and I think to the extent that those can become ingrained, then there is some permanent change, but that is what remains to be seen. Great. On behalf of the USC Center on Philanthropy and Public Policy, I want to thank all of you, and especially my speakers, Wendy, Tony, and Dannielle.